Howdy, everyone. This week's guest is Renn, who authors the newsletter The Masculinist. I wanted to let you know quickly that can be found in the show notes. I highly recommend subscribing for his once-a-month newsletter. And without further ado, meet Renn. All right, welcome to another episode of Canon Calls. I'm your host, Jake McAtee, and this week we have the opportunity to speak with Renn out of New York City. Renn, thank you again so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
I was just mentioning I'd love to kind of get to know you personally and then find out, kind of give folks the experience of what it's like to receive a Masculinist newsletter. Who are you?
Well, I am a writer on urban policy in New York. Also a Christian, a Presbyterian here in the city. I'm originally from rural southern Indiana. It's been said of me that I love cities like only someone from a town of 29 people can. From Indiana, lived most of my adult life in Chicago. Did a lot of work in the management consulting field, particularly in the technology side of that. And I'm married to my wife, Katie, and we have a 2-year-old son. Awesome.
There's been several episodes of this podcast and even just with Canon Press Media that your name has been mentioned. C.R. Wiley was in town a few weeks ago, and he talked about how much he enjoyed your work and was indebted to your work. So you've kind of been this name. You run a newsletter, and so it's sort of been this... I feel like it's kind of been this underground. You may be the Christian dark web.
Yeah, I do run a monthly email newsletter called The Masculinist.
Okay.
Literally one email per month that is about the intersection of Christianity and masculinity. What I saw was that men in our society are increasingly failing today, or certainly falling behind where they should be. We see this in the fact that, about 60% of the people getting college degrees today are women, and we're now down to 40% men. You've seen tremendous rises in, tremendous declines in prime working age labor force participation. We now have people who are in that 25 to 54-year-old age group who aren't in school, aren't in training, aren't in a job, who are proverbially sitting at home in mom's basement playing video games. We're seeing a lot of opioid deaths. We're seeing very low family formation rates. And so there's been a lot of kind of negative trends among men in America. At the same time, we see two kind of divergent responses to that. One, a lot of men are turning to essentially secular men's gurus or movements. Jordan Peterson is by far the biggest of those. His book, 12 Rules for Life, I think it was, sold over 2 million copies. I mean, it's incredible. This is a guy who's getting hundreds of thousands of views on 2-3 hour lectures on Genesis. He's right. In-depth lectures. It's crazy. Or you think about a guy like Joe Rogan, who does these like 2.5 hour podcasts that are drawing 7-figure views. And on down the line, there's a ton of these people out there that are just drawing hordes of mostly young men. Now, some of them, like Peterson and Rogan, are mostly fairly anodyne, and yet I think it's notable. Virtually none of them are Christian. Virtually none of them are Christian. They are either atheists or New Age. There are a handful that are sort of explicitly neo-pagans, although I'm not sure what they really believe there. And at the same time, the church has essentially failed to reach men, particularly single men. There are men who kind of go along with their wives to church when they have kids, but the church itself has a significant female skew and has for a while. And when Jordan Peterson is drawing hordes of these young men, and the church is drawing essentially nothing, I thought that's a real problem. And especially when you add to that the fact that many of the ministries that have targeted men and the people who've targeted men have essentially been flops. Famously, Mark Driscoll's ministry blew up.
Yep.
We've also had a lot of talk about purity culture lately. that wasn't explicitly a men's ministry, but his has had a lot of men involved in it. It's talked to a lot of men. And then I just saw that whoever the current CEO is of Promise Keepers has a book out, and I'm like, Promise Keepers still exists? I mean, they used to sell out stadiums, and just when that, and then like, what happened? And so the church has really failed to do it. And what I basically saw is that the church, unfortunately, had had the truth about Christ, which is the most important truth, but in many other respects had a lot of things wrong. And so I wanted to kind of inject myself in here, not to try to become a Christian Jordan Peterson or a Christian intellectual dark web, who, by the way, are other of these basically secular men's gurus, Dave Rubin and
right.
all guys.
Ben Shapiro.
All of them are, drawing huge numbers of mostly men. Ben Shapiro is more of a political character. He at least is a practicing Jew.
Right.
So he's not an atheist or a secular guy, but still, I mean, it's fair to say he's not Christian. And drawing all these massive numbers of people, and again, Christians are just not in the game, and so we had to get in the game, and that's sort of why I started it. I wanted to essentially create a maybe it's a little bit of a think tank, maybe it's a little bit of an R&D operation, but just really start laying out from a Christian perspective the issues around masculinity and the faith in the world and what's going on in the world, and try to speak into that, and doing it from the genre of cultural criticism. Meaning, I am not a pastor. I have not gone to seminary. I am not trying to set myself up as an authoritative Bible teacher, but I want to take on some of the things that these other guys are taking on that, frankly, they got right. They may have got their metaphysics wrong, and in some respects, they may have got their moral system wrong. In some cases, extremely wrong.
Right.
Some of these guys are actually not good people. But you look at some guys like Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro. Hey, you know what? They've got a number of things that are right, and what can we learn about what's right, and what can not just from them, but in general, and correct some of these negative kind of non-scriptural views that have infected the church. And so that is, I started it, and thanks to people like you sharing the word, it's grown significantly over the last 3 years I've been doing it.
Which is super encouraging. And one of the things when I first subscribed that I noticed, and even in just your analysis just now, that all of these evidences and fruits of masculinity gone wrong in our nation, you are taking on things going on, masculinity in the church, and it's not that pastors or popular Christian male writers talking about masculinity have been silent about the subject, but you are taking on what they are actually talking about and why it's upside down or entirely wrong or entirely false. So like popular men such as Tim Keller, John Piper, Eldridge, Chandler, so we've had teaching on masculinity. What happened that it's to this point? What happened that you had to start the Masculinist?
Well, I'm not the first person to ever talk about, the problem of church reaching men. Okay. So I think one of the things I want to have is a humility about what I am able to accomplish.
Sure.
And the reality is that, the road is littered with the bodies of people who tried and failed. It's easy to make fun of the Promise Keepers or Mark Driscoll, but the real question is, why am I going to be any different? And I think I need to be realistic that this is a high risk endeavor, and need to have some humility about what I'm doing. I don't want to be overly arrogant in believing that I have all the answers. What I like to say is I'm on a quest, for the truth, along with hopefully other people that are engaging in this. But the church, the Christian church, has skewed female for quite a while, and there have been a number of books written about it. One of the most famous is a book called The Church Impotent by Leon Podles,
okay.
who I believe is Catholic.
Okay.
I'm not really sure exactly what his story is, but he essentially locates the roots of this female skew in Christianity, in the Middle Ages. He kind of traces it back to the Middle Ages, to bridal mysticism, and a number of other things. And um, I'm not an expert enough on the history to really judge that part of it. Um, but I do think it's interesting, as he points out, if you think about the stereotype, think about other religions besides Christianity, and think about the first images that come into your mind, right? If you think about Judaism, you think about men in yarmulkes, or maybe in a more Hasidic garb, ultra orthodox garb, and they're praying.
Right.
Or you think about Islam, it's a group of men praying. Or you think about the Sikhs, and it's a man in his ceremonial turban. And it's like, the thing is, what you see, the images of these other religions are highly masculine. And they are tremendously practiced, by men, and in fact, men may even be the driving force of them. Whereas Christianity itself has been, I'm not going to say there's no men. Obviously, you think about Christianity, maybe you think of Christ on the cross, for example, or you think of a picture of Jesus. But you think about, like, the average Christian, it's a little bit hard to think about what might come to mind there. So there's something a little bit unique about Christianity there.
Hmm.
But it goes back a way, and Podol's was one attempt. Another more contemporary attempt was a book by a guy named maybe David Morrow, "Why Men Hate Going to Church."
Okay.
He wrote, and he sort of says that the church isn't reaching men because of, essentially, he takes essentially a business school approach to it. He says, these pastors sort of took a market segmentation analysis, and essentially, women became the customer of evangelicalism of the church, and therefore they serve their customer base.
Hmm.
And women consume most of Christian media. They're this and that. So essentially, like, it's a sort of a marketing. It's sort of a marketing view.
Right.
Who is our customer? And it sort of became, this is the market that we're targeting. But what I think is a more compelling take on it comes from a source very few people have read, but it's a British academic named Callum Brown, who wrote a book called The Death of Christian Britain. And I heard of him when I was reading Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, because Charles Taylor kind of cited this guy very approvingly. And what I found interesting, he did that even though kind of Brown's take on secularization was a little different than Taylor. But Brown, effectively looking mostly at England, but these trends apply in the US, said that around 1800, there was a tremendous shift in the perception of Christianity, from, as essentially piety being seen as primarily a male domain, or a male mode, or and a masculine attribute, to a more feminine attribute. And women came to be seen as naturally good, as guardians of essentially piety, and men came to be seen as essentially the greatest threat to their families, to their home. And essentially, the church, in his almost his own words, he says that the church's signature attribute was its demonization of men.
Hmm.
Often things like drinking or gambling or fighting. You can think about, for example, the temperance movement, that was very, very much on that. And so the church started to portray women as very naturally angelic, and essentially men as the great victimizers of innocent women. And this probably relates to industrialization. The other thing that was happening at this time was industrialization. We were moving from a household mode of production, right, to a factory mode of production. And that involved a complete transformation of the household sphere. In essence, the household was, the process was begun of draining it of its, traditional functions. In pre-industrial culture, the household was essentially a self-sufficient subsistence economy. There wasn't a lot of trade with the world. In the Middle Ages, for example, I've read that Most people never even saw money their entire life.
Wow.
Paid rent to your feudal lord in crops and in labor.
Right.
And so now you're in a situation where the husband is no longer farming, right? The wife is no longer involved in food, clothing, and other aspects of the home. And instead, the husband's at work in a factory and the wife is at home, essentially becoming a homemaker. And this process, which really kind of got underway here in the 1830s, introduced tremendous new vulnerabilities um, into the system. And essentially, women who had previously been in very productive roles, even if it was in the home, it was a very productive role. Virtually all of, in the early 1800s, virtually all the cloth that was manufactured in the United States was homespun, was manufactured at home. And now women are essentially had become dependent on men for uh, for their income, and therefore, if men really screwed up, and they were often outside the home, and so they were able to get in more trouble. This really put the woman in a very bad situation, and so you really see this. This also comes through in Tocqueville, by the way, when he talks about kind of the guardian women as guardians of virtue, and so I think there's some understandable reasons for this related to that transition period into industrial society. Um, but for whatever reason, it was probably really in the 1800s that there was this shift. And what you basically see is it carries on through to today, certainly in Protestant land that I'm familiar with. Essentially, men are to blame for everything. Men are perpetually, one step away from falling into perdition. Men are ruthlessly berated by these pastors. Men as a gender are excoriated as a group, whereas women are essentially given a complete and total pass on everything. Now, just because that's happening doesn't mean that men are themselves perfect.
Sure.
There's a lot of legitimate things for which men can be criticized, but we have a system that's totally out of whack and totally out of balance. And essentially, when you listen to what people like um, Mark Driscoll or Matt Chandler, some of these guys would say about men is like, why would any man with even like a modicum of self-respect sit there and listen to this, to sit there and be berated by this? And so essentially, I think they sort of modeled themselves, maybe Driscoll, a little bit on the drill sergeant. What they forgot is that the drill sergeant isn't just there to tear you down; he's also there to build you back up into something else. And that was kind of what was I think lost. It became a very it's very distinct. I mean, you just look at any of these guys and how they talk about men, and it's very little that's useful. And in fact, um, they also, to the extent that they do give practical advice to men, it's practically always worthless.
Right.
They can be very good on some biblical teachings, but they can be very bad on a lot of other things. And frankly, they that's one of the reasons I always try to say, look, I'm a cultural commentator. I'm not a Bible teacher. I don't want to set myself up, as an area where I'm out of my lane a little bit. And I think to some extent, these pastors often speak in a genre of cultural commentary and never clearly delineate when they're in one mode versus the other. And that's why how things like purity culture go wrong. I mean, the reality is the Bible doesn't say anything about dating.
Right.
So a lot of what's being said is really not, per se biblical or part of a historic Christian tradition. It's an attempt to apply Christian principles to modern culture, but it sort of comes through in some way as if it's authoritative. And sometimes it can be very good, and sometimes it can be very bad. But when it goes bad, then it ends up discrediting the church
Right.
as well. I think that's one reason. It's my last little bit here is that's one reason I wanted to speak as a layperson, because that way, if I say, look, I'm a cultural commentator, I'm a layperson, and I tell you something and it doesn't work and it's wrong, then it's very easy. It's like, oh, this guy screwed up,
Right.
right?
Right.
not Jesus Christ screwed me over by putting me in this church where this guy just totally wrecked my life.
Right. I'm curious to know what you think. So you mentioned Promise Keepers. I remember back when I was in youth group, we were taken to a sold out stadium to go to True Love Waits, which I think was is the Baldwins thing. If one of the Baldwins.
Yeah.
What is it that you mentioned, whether it was Jordan Peterson or Michael Foster was on recently and talked about Jocko Willink's influence. These kind of guys who seem to be winning the day in the masculinity realm. What is it that those guys are getting right that the church hasn't been able to quite grasp yet? And if they attempted it, you mentioned Mark Driscoll, they've kind of failed at that.
Yeah. Well, one thing that they have is just you get this sense of empathy that a guy like Peterson has.
Hmm.
He's a therapist, right? He's a psychologist, and he's actually a clinical practicing therapist, or at least was until he got super famous.
Right.
And so his ability to come across as someone who actually cares about you, right? Even when he's challenging you to be better, is um, I think can't be overstated. And I think there's a legitimate question. I think a lot of people in the pews can ask if you're a man. It's like, is my pastor on my side,
Yeah.
right? Or not in the sense is just will take my side in a dispute just that thing, but like, does this person really have my best interest at heart? I think there's honestly there's like there's some open questions about that for some guys. I would probably wonder that about some of the stuff that happened with Driscoll.
Right.
So that's one thing that they have. A second thing is that they are aspirational. They're aspirational in that they create a vision of masculinity that is very appealing to men. Now, some of that is something that I would say is not necessarily um, Christian or even positive. So there's an element of Nietzscheanism in a lot of these people, a lot of will to power.
Hmm.
You, the man, need to be strong. You need to be alpha. You need to impose your will upon the world. You need to be dominant. You need to stop worrying about all these other people. That's what they've been telling you, worry about other people your whole life. You need to start worrying about yourself and your dreams and your plans and work harder and be more driven. But nevertheless, they sort of say there's a little bit of an implication. It's like all these kind of self-help guys. Think about Tony Robbins, for example. Awaken the giant within. It's just sort of a positivity, and it's sort of like a lot of these guys also give you the implicit sense that, hey, if you do what I do, you will become as successful as I am.
Right.
And so I think that's one thing. They create an aspirational vision. And then the third thing is they just get some things right. They get just like things right that the church gets wrong. So the one I always like to use as the classic example is that the church gets wrong is the idea that the servant leader is someone that is attractive to women. Women want to be with a servant leader. And by a servant leader, they say that he's someone who is, on fire for God, who is living a holy life, who is very nice, conscientious, kind, honest, has personal integrity, is someone who likes to give, who likes to serve others. That if you're like this, if you embody this ideal, that's what women want to marry. And Matt Chandler explicitly said, he said godliness is sexy to godly people. He literally says godliness is sexy. You can basically describe it in that way. Don Carson basically makes the same kinds of statements. Like, I think he said something along the lines of kindness is the greatest aphrodisiac in marriage. Right? Yeah. It's like if you are this way, your wife will want to have sex with you. I mean, frankly speaking, a lot of these guys are basically prosperity gospel on that point.
Right.
And since we're on your show, I have to say, Doug Wilson, some of his writings in the past have come across in that servant leader mode.
Oh,
I think he's going to talk about, the women can sense the aroma of, the godliness and leading well. And so I think there's a baby boomer. I always say there's a baby boomer aspect to this
right,
that's there. And um, the fact is that's just totally, totally false.
right,
Okay. I think what we basically conflate is different things. It's like, what is what is true, right? There's things that are true. Uh, there are things that are good. There are things that we would like to be true. Many other things. And I think that a lot of this, there's this assumption that somehow because being godly is a good thing, is an important, it must be something that makes you attractive. When in fact that's not the case. And so what I think they get right is that many of the attributes, I'm not going to say I totally endorse the servant leader concept, I don't,
right.
but many of the things that they say are in fact things that every man must develop and cultivate in his life. Every man should be godly, should be kind, should be honest, should be conscientious. Many of those qualities are mandatory, not just for men, for all of us. But what they are things that make you a good candidate to marry.
That's good.
They don't make you attractive. It's like, I think as a man, you could instantly get this. It's like, what women do you find attractive? And then which of them, right, or which women in general would be good candidates for marriage? Those are kind of two separate categories of things. And so, what are women attracted to in men? What makes you attractive to them is things like power and status, confidence and charisma, um, good looks and style, money. I actually think I put money at the end deliberately. I don't think money is that, but when you look at that Donald Sterling and his 21,
Yeah,
that 87-year-old Clippers guy with a 21-year-old Thai supermodel girlfriend. It's like, money maybe just has a little bit to do with that
right.
there. But it's like that there's an old John Cougar Mellencamp song about you better learn how to play guitar if you want to like date this this girl in high school. It's like the whole thing. It's like, yeah, become like the indie rocker, become the cool kid, and like when we're like. So I think secular culture is actually much more honest about that than a church culture. And Jordan Peterson says women are attracted to men who win status competitions with other men. And
Right.
like he says that, which is true. Go over to Matt Chandler, and he says godliness is sexy, which is not true. And yeah, I think maybe Chandler is just, he's not wrong to say you have to be godly, right?
Right.
You can be a man who is very, very successful by all of the measures of attractiveness that women will be very, very, very attracted to you. And yet you can be an evil person and someone that any Christian woman should stay far, far away from. So there's just two categories of things: what makes you attractive and what makes you a good marriage prospect or a good husband, good father. And you need to work on both of those, right? And the church only tells you to work on one set of attributes, not on the other set of attributes. And that's why a lot of these guys, what are they telling you? Get in the gym,
Yeah.
right? They're telling you be more confident. They're telling you stop apologizing for yourself all the time. And they're just giving a lot of practical tips. And in fact, um, some of these guys are, again, not the good guys, but a lot of guys just flat out pickup artists. I will show you how to simulate techniques that will make women be attracted to you so you can have sex with them, basically. And, uh, the reality is a lot of those techniques work. There was an article in New York Magazine about these two guys who were pickup artists. They were coffee shop owners by day and pickup artists by night. And they had been running essentially a hipster coffee shop, but they were pickup artists. And they had been running a blog. They've been running a blog, detailing their conquests. And then somebody found out who they were and made the connection. And you can imagine the firestorm that came
Right.
out of that. They had had sex with something like 40 something women.
Wow.
So it must have worked for them. And so I think there's this aspect that they're giving you these techniques that are, maybe often amoral, or, immoral. And the Nietzschean view of life is not good, but they're telling you how to become more successful at things that are very primal to young men. And so I think that we, as the church, need to take a step back and reflect: what does godly attractiveness look like, right?
Right.
And things of that. And so that's where I'd like to see us do a lot more on it, right?
No, that's really
And I think it's a little hard sometimes for pastors, because if you look at the average pastor that I see, most of them married very young.
mm,
Many of them got married like in college or in seminary. They probably didn't date a whole lot of women. They certainly have no experience dating at older stages of life like many people have today. The other thing is, when you start out in your career, maybe you're a youth pastor or you're a college ministry guy, and then you're like, you're preaching, you're the pastor of a church. When you're like in those positions, you're in the highest status position in your ecosystem, if you will. So if you are the leader of the campus ministry, you're the leader, you're the number one staff guy. This is what Matt Chandler, he writes this book. Um, it's called The Mingling of Souls. When he would talk about running a Bible study in college, and I don't know the whole story here, but it's kind of crazy. He apparently had 1,000 people in a Bible study when
right.
he was a college student. And he would talk about how women would throw themselves at him and try to make him think that they were exactly what they thought he wanted. It's like they were putting on a big show. They were changing themselves to try to conform to what he wanted, right? That's almost the opposite of the servant leader, but he can't put two and two together on that.
Right.
I will say he very wisely did not initially let his now wife know that he was running this gigantic Bible study. He wanted to make sure that she was interested in him for him, not just interested in him because he had this like huge Bible study, because he understood that if she knows I'm like standing up on front of a stage in front of massive numbers of people, it's going to generate attraction that may not be based to who I am as a person. And so I think he knows it, he gets it. And he's elsewhere said, attraction is a strange, ambiguous force. So at some level they get it, but their messaging is a little off, I think, but it needs to be reflected on. Um, and and so I think a lot of times maybe these pastors believe that women were attracted to them when they were young because they were so godly, but in fact it may have just been because they were like in a high status position
That's
in
really
a
good. And
situation.
I think when you were even mentioning, so like guys like D.A. Carson or um, Chandler can say those things about godliness is sexy or kindness being an aphrodisiac. Um, it does seem convenient to be able to, like you were saying, in their places of high status. I mean, eh, I'd be curious to find a guy, who's 30 visiting some singles group. If it doesn't seem like all those guys have to live in reality is basically, I guess, what I'm saying. So it does seem like they do get it. I wonder if they would just say those things are worldly. That's not the Christian way. Regenerated Christians are not attracted to those kinds of things. When maybe, in fact, it's just that they're conflating what you were saying.
There's nothing wrong, um, with being attracted to those things.
Sure.
Like, and is it better to have a husband that makes more money or less money? Generally speaking, more money,
Yeah.
right? The more that he's capable of doing, uh, generally the better he can provide for his family. So there's not, I don't think these things are bad. But I think there's a vision of how things ought to be
Right.
embedded in their view that essentially denies reality. Um, and so yeah, I can't fully explain it.
I'm curious to know, you brought it up, as far as the purity culture stuff. That's obviously come rolling back into the mainstream with all the events of Josh Harris. When you see all of the talk about purity culture, whether it was like highly damaging, um, or it wasn't, the two sides of that coin. What is your take on how purity culture was handled and what's going on today with it?
My knowledge of purity culture is somewhat limited. I did not become a Christian until later in life, and so missed purity culture.
Okay.
I did read um, Joshua Harris's book, "I Kissed Dating Goodbye," and uh, I actually wrote a Masculinist number 7. If you look at it online, talks a little bit about it. Uh, I think that the thing with Josh Harris is very sad. I think that
Right.
he's being made a scapegoat
Totally.
for a lot of things. He was 21 years old when he wrote "I Kissed Dating Goodbye," and his parents were sort of Christian celebrities, and he talks about in his documentary. There's this documentary about him that came out last year. I survived. I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Where he's sort of reflecting on it, and he talks about attending. I think it was a True Love Waits event in Washington D.C. with like 250,000 people, all putting their little purity pledges in the ground, and he attended that before he wrote "I Kissed Dating Goodbye." So he was a product of the purity culture as much as the creator of it. And um, so what I would say is, just looking at his book, I look at it and I say, I'm very glad that nothing I wrote when I was 21 sold 1 million copies.
Right.
Right? Think about that.
100%.
When you were pushed, and you can think about it this, you can read about all the tabloid stuff about a guy like Justin Bieber. Like, here's a guy, right, that became famous when he was what, 12 or 14.
Right.
And it's just like there's something about becoming super famous very early in life before you have really matured. I mean, I don't know that I'd want to be famous now. You know what I mean? Like, it's not great. I'm a
Right.
little, I sort of am like two minds about, like, what I do in some extent, because it's like it's just it's nice. It makes you feel good, rush it, boost your status and all that. But it also kind of messes with you. And I think that when you started looking at it, I think there were a few things that came wrong out of "I Kissed Dating Goodbye." One is what I said earlier. It conflated essentially life coaching with the Bible.
Hmm.
There's a ton of life coaching in the book, and it was not clearly delineated from the Bible. And
Right.
so so when the life coaching is wrong, you discredit a little bit Christianity. The second um, is, other people have criticized this prosperity gospel aspect of it, in that there's almost this soulmate fallacy.
Right.
God has this person picked out for you from beyond time.
Right.
If you just wait and are sexually pure, will magically appear, and uh, and you'll have a great, amazing marriage, which didn't always happen. A lot of people didn't have great, amazing marriages when they got married. They had terrible marriages. And some people also didn't find anyone. I mean, and the third thing I would say is that it's sort of this idea that if you did not stay totally sexually pure, if you did end up having sex or doing, even who even knows what else might have counted in that, you were essentially damaged goods, and it was all over for you, right? You've permanently ruined yourself.
Right.
So I think those were a couple things that went wrong. There is no prosperity gospel. Again, we have to really avoid conflating life advice with scripture. Number two, we have to be very clear that not only is there no soulmate fallacy, but actually finding a spouse today, if you're a guy listening, finding a wife and then building a successful marriage is a degree of difficulty high endeavor. And we need to bring the same focus, intentionality, and effort to that we do to getting into the right college, to getting into the right career. I'm always struck. We spend unbelievable years and years and years making plans and taking actions and building our resume and doing things to achieve dreams around the city we want to live in, the college we want to go to, the job we want to have, the lifestyle we want to have. And then we sort of just, even today, so like, well, it'll just happen. There's this idea that it'll just happen to get married. It requires phenomenal intentionality and a lot of hard work and delayed gratification. And I do think this idea of around essentially, if you've had sex or you've watched porn or you've done all those things, there has to be the possibility um, of kind of redemption for you, which I think we shouldn't take that too far and suggest that there are no consequences to sexual sin. The Institute for Family Studies, which publishes academic research,
Yep.
put out a chart that basically showed that, frankly, the number of sex partners you have over your lifetime affects your likelihood of getting divorced.
Wow.
And if you even go with like sex partner count of two, for women, they have a significantly elevated divorce risk
Hmm.
over someone who only ever had sex with their spouse. And again, correlation's not causation. We could say a lot of things here, but we shouldn't be naive and suggest that ultimately there's no there will never be any consequences. But I think over and over we see, with every form of sin. Think about alcoholism. Think about the people who follow the alcoholism or drugs. Many of them for years, and yet were able to come out of that and rebuild their lives. I mean, I knew a guy. I've known people who were 20-year drug addicts. I knew a guy in my old church in Chicago. He spent 25 years in prison being an accessory to murder. Today he's married, Christian, like living a different life. So the possibility is always there.
Right.
The idea. So I don't want to suggest that we take a blasé attitude towards watching porn or whatever. We should not take a blasé attitude towards watching porn, but we should also recognize that, it's like, oh, one mistake and your life is over.
Right.
Sometimes that does happen to people, but I think that we shouldn't assume that is the rule for everyone.
Right. I'm curious to know if you think, is there anything that's, as everybody is piling on the purity culture thing, is anything happening in the vacuum of that as far as like, I know that the meaning of marriage came out maybe in the last decade and you mentioned mingling of souls. Is there anything like, what is the current field as far as these topics go? I know you've been doing the Masculinist you're on the 35th one. So, do you see a turn in the topic, or do you think this will be a while?
Well, what I would say is purity culture is emblematic of the fact that there is a culture of zero accountability inside essentially the church. And I think we saw this most tragically in the Catholic Church with their abuse scandals, where they still don't get it. Right?
Right.
It's like mind-boggling to me. And so I think the issue is not that I want people to fall on their swords or
Right.
voted off the island or something.
Right.
I feel like, again, trying to make Joshua Harris the scapegoat, but I think we ought to really have, and that's what I say. Come back to the beginning. I look at the road around church and men is littered with like failures.
Sure.
And so what we have to do is we have to be honest and admit where we failed and say what went wrong, how did it go wrong, and how can we avoid making that happen again. That doesn't happen. Things kind of go away. Nobody talks about them anymore. Many of the people involved with them, like, Martin Driscoll has essentially been airbrushed out of a Politburo photo, as I like to say. Of a lot of people who were previously kind of like big backers of him, and so there's no that. And I think what we're going to see, there are going to be many likely future blowups, even in this space. I'm an urban guy. My writing is on cities. I love cities, and all the stuff that's said about cities is absolutely true. But I also see here in New York all these kind of like church plants, and I see massive numbers of single people, overwhelmingly single Christian population, and I just see so many people, mostly women, but not all women, who are like now in their 40 plus, never got married, desperately wanted to have kids, wanted to be married.
Hmm.
Some of them have written very heart-rending, you know, essays about it and like how it didn't work out. And I'm like, at what point does this become the next blow up? And people start asking, like, some of these women start saying, like the people who read, Joshua Harris's book, hey, was my pastor really giving me the best advice by essentially encouraging me to stay in a place where, like New York City, where the dating waters are famously toxic and shark infested, right? I mean, how many TV shows, Sex in the City, or Girl, how many shows have been made
Right.
about, dating in New York or in DC or in San Francisco or in Seattle or in these places? And so I think there's going to be, I think there's plenty of opportunities for more things to be, more problems. And again, I always say this, that the first person I did be worried about that is myself.
Right.
Right. And so at least I'm trying to position myself so that, if there's like a blow up in what I do, right, if it's like Paul said, let any man who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. The fact is, I could suffer a catastrophic moral failure. I'm not immune to that, but I try to like isolate it. But I also want to just try about what am I getting wrong and what could I be getting wrong, and am I too much of the zeitgeist, myself,
Hmm.
drawing on, Jordan Peterson or different, different trends. And when those trends are gone and now everything's different, we're going to look back and say, oh my gosh, what did we do? And so I think, there's this point of we have to start with taking responsibility for ourselves. And so that's what I want to do. And I hope that, where I'm wrong, I want to be able to kind of acknowledge and correct that as soon as I can. So I certainly I always welcome people who want to push back
Right.
On what I'm saying, because I feel like it's important to have, like, different views out there and to be responsive to them.
That's really good. Aaron Renn, thank you again so much for coming on. I've appreciated your work. Had the benefit of meeting you earlier last year. Just as somebody who's grown up, I grew up in the non-denominational world. We went to those, like I mentioned, we went to Baldwin's True Love Waits at some point, and I've read many of the books that, you talk about in the Masculinist. And, when I read them, it just was water off the duck's back. Nothing didn't strike me as weird or strange or anything like that. So I'm appreciate your humbleness, and I'm very grateful for the work that you do.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.